Hello, and today I'm going to be showing you a scenario where the Arab League united in the modern day. Obviously, this could never happen, but what if it did? Would they manage to become a kind of third side between the West and the Chinese and Russians? The first thing we'll notice here is poor old Israel, kind of just stuck in between this absolutely gigantic state. They would control a massive population and probably the largest oil reserves in the world. They would also all have a common religion. So although language would be a slight issue between dialects, they have similar language, similar culture. It would be more stable than some of the other ones. However, the Middle East and even parts of North Africa are not the most stable, with rebellions and civil wars going on even today. We would also have some poor regions like Somalia dragging the whole empire down. We can begin though, because Israel recently has had forces over here in Gaza. And that region is now controlled by this absolutely gigantic nation. So poor old Israel would be stuck at war with one of the largest and most powerful countries to ever exist. This would not be winnable, and although controversial, the Arab Empire, or the newest Muslim caliphate, would be taking control over all of the Levant and annexing Israel. The USA and most of the West would be against this. But what are they gonna do? If you go against this, you go against like a third of the world's oil reserves. And they're not only doing bad things for the US, they're also helping them in some ways. And that way is gonna be a war with Iran. Iran is probably their largest competitor right now, but it's not much of a competition. When you compare these two powers, Saudi Arabia alone can rival Iran. All of the Arab world combined is gonna wipe the floor with them. So we're just gonna quickly see the Arabs push into southern Persia, managing to capture important oil reserves while starting a naval invasion to cut them off from global trade. Iran would be supported mainly by the Russians, but seeing as Russia still has a failing invasion of Ukraine going on, Iran would be incredibly alone in this war. Nobody would really be willing to support them. And although the Arabs would see trouble in the Iranian mountains, in the south along the coast, they would see massive gains. And slowly but surely, Iran would fall as internal pressure, and of course, the massive invasion from probably the third most powerful country in the world, absolutely demolishing them. The north falls, and soon enough, Tehran is captured. Followed by this, rebellions would spur up all across the country, as the government is doing okay, but they're still not exactly popular. And I've no doubt that the Arabs would win this, seeing as they have a common religion, even if it is split by a decent Sunni divide. They would still be able to contain the region, despite their completely different culture and history. This would immediately catapult them on the world stage, as they now control even more oil. Oil would be by far their biggest bargaining chip. Already, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Kuwait, Iran, and Iraq are some of the richest countries because of their oil. And all of them combined would be more influential than Russia without a doubt. They would still be heavily behind the US and China, but at this point they would have surpassed Russia. And this is when their expansion into Africa would begin. Many nations across Africa, Mali, Niger, Chad, parts of northern Nigeria, northern Cameroon, Eritrea, etc., these are all Muslim majority areas. And the Arabs would be looking to unite all of them while at the same time expanding their own influence. However, there would be much resistance, especially in the east, where the East African Federation would pop up as their main rival. Is this realistic? Once again, not a chance. But we want to give them some sort of challenge. We can't just let them expand forever. That would be absolutely no fun. And this alliance would quickly spread into not just East Africa, but much of Central Africa, simply to counteract this major Arab state. However, Eritrea would be invaded and annexed as well. That's just not really even a challenge. It's a tiny little nation, and it would unite the Somali and Sudanese parts of the empire. From there, they would start invasions down south into Mali, Niger, and Chad. And sadly, despite Chad being, of course, incredibly Giga Chad, it would not be nearly enough to stop them. And all three of these nations would quickly fall. This may make them the second largest country in the world, but definitely the third ahead of the US and China. Still behind Russia, I would assume. And this is when the East African Federation would turn into the African Union, with Nigeria an incredibly powerful state in the region, along with Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, Benin, and multiple other equatorial African countries joining the alliance, along with some southern African countries and Mozambique. This is of course preparing for the major war that's going to take place in this video. Sadly for them, expansion into Turkey is not possible due to the NATO alliance, but if we assume that that does not exist, they may attempt to support some Kurdish rebels in the south in order to expand their own influence. They currently control a lot of Kurdish majority regions in their country. And if some sort of autonomy was given, it's possible the Kurds would support them in conquering southern Turkey. It's also possible that some invasions would go against Afghanistan. Currently, Iran and Afghanistan aren't the best of friends, not even close, and the Afghani regime is not exactly the nicest or the most stable. So there's a good chance that these two powers would end up at war. This would not even be much of a challenge if I'm being honest with you. Afghanistan is incredibly unstable, whilst this Arab state, we're gonna assume, just blessed by God, is going to have no rebellions and no issues conquering these new lands. They may even expand their invasions up into Central Asia to secure influence over the region. At this point though, China would likely step in to get them to back off of many of these Central Asian countries, specifically Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, and an agreement would be made. The Muslim Empire would be allowed to take many parts of Afghanistan and Turkmenistan. However, the rest of these lands would be put under a Chinese mandate, which would be semi-independent, or even fully independent in the case of Uzbekistan. It's even possible they form a united Stanistan to stand up to this new Muslim threat. Overall, these expansions aren't really important to them, but it is still cool that it has finally created the wonderful nation of Stanistan for the whole world to enjoy, even if it would be heavily under Chinese influence. God. I'm not even going to put that in. The point is, they've expanded into Central Asia, and from here, the most important war will begin, as tensions between them and the East Africans have only gone up and up. The Nile River is a specific point of contention, as Ethiopia has completely stopped negotiating with them, and all of these nations are taking advantage, heavily harming people up here in the northern Nile, destroying their water reserves, and just overall weakening them very, very heavily. Because of that, the Arabs would want to basically go against them and start a war to secure complete and total African dominance, which would be probably their most major current goal. If they can secure their influence over Africa, there will really be nothing anybody else can do against them. Their control over natural resources would make them the most powerful country in the world, well, besides the USA. And militarily, at this point, they would also probably have the largest military in the world, surpassing China. Kurdish rebels may have had some success at this point. They have been fighting for years, and if the Arabs got involved directly, assuming that NATO, for whatever reason, doesn't get involved or just doesn't exist in this world, Arab expansion up into Anatolia and even into Cyprus would be a possibility. Not very important, but it would make their borders look significantly nicer, as at this point they would start another major invasion for oil against Azerbaijan and Armenia. Azerbaijani oil reserves are even better than some of those in Arabia, which should be another major boost to them. At this point, nobody can really go against them. They probably have half the world's oil. I keep talking about it, but it's just absurd how overpowered their supply of this product is. Africa at this point has been expanding, as both Togo, Liberia, and Sierra Leone joined the alliance, along with Gabon and Angola, who is a major help to the alliance. It's even possible that more southern African countries like Botswana would have joined at this point. And looking outside of this region, there's even a possibility of another alliance showing up between Pakistan and Central Asia, or Stanistan. And a possibility if NATO does not exist. If it does, then this would quite obviously not work. But if NATO does not exist, then a Southern European alliance would be a major possibility. These are not major threats to them, and they will not end up at war. They have taken what they need from Anatolia, and this is simply going to be annoying as they may try and supply the sub-Saharan Africans in their war. Or at the very least, politically be against almost any action that the Arabians may take. Now, for the Great War to begin, the Great African War for complete and total dominance over the continent. I'm going to be trying to make this interesting. So we are going to have it begin in Burkina Faso in Western Africa, as they declare war on Senegal. Senegal has literally days before the invasion joined the African Union. Sadly for the Arabians, this information had not reached them yet, and because of that, all of a sudden, they are in a massive war against most of Africa. Although it already looks like the Arabians are in a great position, it's only even going to get better, as these armies are all on their own, they're all disorganized. These countries aren't friends. They all have issues politically. They are not friends. They are simply trying to win this war together. And because of that, their armies will be incredibly disorganized and not helping each other. Instead, they will be going against each other, and it's even possible that infighting takes place. However, the Arabians would take advantage to invade the rest of Western Africa, and this would turn from a jumble of states to pretty much the entire continent, or at least most of it, aside from some of the south, against the Arabians. If they lose this war, there is no doubt that Arabia will take complete control of Africa, and that will make them very, very powerful in the future. Their invasion would of course begin in Senegal, where they already had forces stationed, preparing for an invasion of Senegal, and all of these countries are far too weak to stand up to them. There is simply no chance. They do not stand a chance at all. However, over in Nigeria, the Arabs would be seeing a lot of supply issues. All of that is the Sahara Desert, and if you don't know, deserts are not exactly ideal for shipping supplies over, so most Arab troops in this region would starve, leading to major Nigerian gains. This may even lead to Angolan and Congolese troops making progress into southern Chad. The Arabs would be mainly focusing on the coast, and on this coast, they would have a major issue called Ethiopia, who is probably the most, well actually, I think Nigeria is stronger at this point. It's been a few years, Nigeria is growing, but they're still one of the most powerful countries in the African Union. So advances into South Sudan would be swift, and it's likely that they would attempt a dual spearhead towards Juba, which is less important, and towards Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, but more importantly, the capital of the African Union, which, not the alliance, but the actual union between every single nation left in Africa at this point. They would start a pincer maneuver from Djibouti and from Sudan to attempt to capture the city. But in the key battle, Ethiopian troops would in fact manage to encircle the Arabians, who were having major issues as Ethiopia, they're now fighting in unfriendly terrain. This whole time, The people didn't want to be under them, but they at least had some similarities. At this point, Ethiopia is fighting for their lives, and in afar, Ethiopia would see many gains, with the front stalemating and turning a lot more to their favor. In fact, with Tanzanian reinforcements, I see it a possibility that Ethiopia will actually manage to counterattack in the poor regions of Somalia, which they would not even attempt to defend. So far, this is actually looking like a blue team victory, rather than the Arabs crushing them how everyone assumed they would, even though they are the more powerful nation. Sadly for the blue team, supply issues won't last forever as they are pushing in quickly from the west, meaning that Nigeria can now not only focus on Niger, how they were doing previously, but now also have to focus on a western front. They are also going to have to focus on an eastern front, as South Sudan has fully capitulated, and sadly for the Central African Republic, they are incredibly poor, one of the poorest nations in the world, and they would not be getting very much aid from just about anyone. So even though Nigerian and Congolese progress into Chad has been swift, their supply lines are crushed from the south with an invasion into the Car, and Chad, clearly the most important region in the world, is recaptured. Eventually, this leads to a complete encirclement of Nigeria, as Cameroon capitulates. Meanwhile, in northern Nigeria and in southern Nigeria, well, over here along the coast, there is mass rebellion. These regions are not considered Nigerian. It is a very diverse country, and they are now rising up in favor of the Arabs in return for autonomy, which they have already been shown to give over in Baluchistan, in Kurdistan, and in Central Asia. This would absolutely crush Nigerian efforts in Niger, and with them being encircled, cut off, and facing rebellion, they would eventually fall completely to overwhelming forces. And from here, it would simply be a slow and painful, especially in the northern Ethiopian mountains, push down south. But it's a consolidated front, and with a few smart maneuvers heading down to Lake Victoria, capturing the rest of the Blue Nile, capturing Addis Ababa, by far the largest moral victory, and of course recapturing Somalia simply for the prestige. Eventually, this war would end on a compromised peace, which wouldn't give them complete control. This is a conditional surrender. It is not an immediate and total unconditional surrender. Instead, it would simply lead to them expanding, gaining a few puppets out of it, but not completely destroying all of their enemies. This would take place in northern Nigeria, in most of the Car, and in all of South Sudan. They would want to push down south all the way down the Nile in order to stop this from happening again. They would also demand complete control of Ethiopia, as that region was simply too painful for them in the previous war, and if they do not take complete control over it, it will likely rebuild and become a new rival for them to deal with. They would also gain a Gold Coast puppet in Nigeria, Togo, Benin, and Cameroon. They really don't have any cultural similarities, but they didn't have any to begin with, so I don't see why this wouldn't work. From here, though, there would be some consolidation. Congo would unite with the rest of Congo, and East Africa would unite amongst themselves. Okay. Their Gold Coast puppet would be, you guessed it, along the Guinean coast, which I believe is also called the Gold Coast. I can't be sure of that, but if it's not, just call this the nation of Greater Guinea, as the only other Guinea would currently be in Papua New Guinea, rather than Equatorial Guinea over here. Oh no, Equatorial Guinea over here, or Guinea-Bissau over here. Obviously, at this point, the world would have changed significantly. Who knows what would have happened in Ukraine, as it would have been possibly 10, 20 plus years since this nation had been created, to now where they are the complete hegemons of all of Africa, which means the world would have changed significantly. Maybe Russia won, maybe they lost, maybe World War III is already broken out, or maybe it never broke out to begin with. You simply cannot know, as it has been 30 years, and they have changed a lot. I also don't think they would align with the Western powers or with the Chinese. They went against allies of both, and, well, they already don't really like either side in real life. The Arabs are currently technically aligned with the Americans, but they are not friends. They most definitely do not want to be friends with the Americans. It's just kind of convenient, I guess. So I really, really doubt they would stay as American allies, but I also doubt they would be Chinese allies. They don't want the Chinese stealing all of their money, all of their anything. And in this case, they are strong enough to go up against the Chinese or any other power all on their own. I don't think they would need backing from a foreign power, similar to how the US can realistically do stuff on their own if they have to. The new nations created in Central Africa would include the Congo, not the Republic of the Congo or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, just one united and, incredibly disunited, but unified state. And of course the East African Federation between what's left of Kenya, Burundi, Rwanda, Uganda, and Tanzania. There may even be something going on in the south, but I doubt it, and the alliance would also be forced to be dismantled, although there are still very good relations between these countries. I can't keep ignoring the rebellions that would be happening in this massive country right now, especially in Ethiopia, who would never accept this. Even if they gained autonomy, I don't think they would ever submit to the Arab rule. With that, I am going to end it here, though. If you want to see just how large they are, I can move them above Russia. They are still smaller than the Russians, but it's even possible they've surpassed the Canadians. This map is incredibly flawed along the equator. It makes Africa look tiny, makes the north, especially in Europe, look gigantic. So they would be even larger than they look currently, so I think they would even be the largest country. Perhaps still behind Russia, but definitely the second largest. With a major industry, not even just relying on oil now, many natural resources in Africa, and a large population. I do hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you next time. Bye.